Okay, let's try this out. This is very strange. I haven't done one of these before. So I'm going to try and do a lecture on Aristotle from home, and there'll be a couple parts to it, but this is the first part. First, I'd like to introduce you to my good friend here, Plato. See right here? This is an Athenian philosopher of great fame. And you know a lot about him now since we studied him in class. But so what we're going to start talking about, which I touched on in class before, is this notion of hylomorphic dualism. So the hylo part refers to matter or material, and the morphic part refers to shape. And so Aristotle thought that, by the way, the first number that I'm going to have you remember right now is 2. Okay? So keep in mind 2, or jot that down, 2. But let's move on. Aristotle thought that substances were a composite of matter and form. So if you see our little piece of Play-Doh here, right now the matter is the Play-Doh, and the form we can imagine to be its shape. So it is kind of shaped like a rectangular solid. But the matter can remain the same, and we can change the shape. We can make it into a ball. And if we were good with clay or something like that, we could make it into some little face that looked like the philosopher Plato, which would be really cool. And if you can do that, bring one into class, and I'll be very impressed. So, and you can say, what do you do when your friends ask you, what do you do in ancient philosophy class? You can say, well, we play with Plato, and that would be accurate. So, we interrupt this broadcast to bring you another number.
9.
Can they see you? Tell them the number. Okay, brilliant. Back to our regularly scheduled programming. Okay. Now, if we look at any particular thing, so we can take, for example, a particular house. I want you to think of all the material that composes that house. So there's a lot of different material. There's wood, there is brick or stone, there are metal parts of the house, there's the siding, there's all these nails, and all this. In my house there's plaster. In your house perhaps there's drywall. Right? These are all things that are parts of the house. But all those things could exist without being parts of that house. There could be many other things made out of all those components, all those ingredients, and they would be completely different. So what is it that makes the house a house, and this particular house, right? So, well, first we have, what is it that makes a house a house? That would be asking, what is the form of the house? What is the form of a house? Which, as we saw in lecture last time, that is related to the essence of the house. So the essence is what makes it what it is. So what is it that makes a house what it is? Well, according to Aristotle, it is this definition. A house is a container sheltering possessions and living bodies. So it's a container. Here's a container, but not a container like this. No, a container that has your possessions in it and your living bodies in it. So I hope you don't try and put your body in there. Now, that definition, that account of the essence of a house is actually quite similar to the type of thing that Plato would give. And in honor of that, we have right here the form of house. This exists in Platonic heaven. I've been leased it for a very short time to be able to show it to you, and this is the form of house. But unlike Plato, Plato would say that the only real house is the form of house, the only genuine house, if he said that there's a form of houses. But Aristotle would say that the as real as houses get is a particular house that is a combination of matter and form. So it's not just one thing, but it's two things. It's a combination of things. So what are these particulars made up of? This is another thing we covered in some ways in the physics. But to reiterate, the bodies of particulars are going to be composed of other things that have matter and form. Okay, so substances are composed of other substances. But the primal substances that everything else is made up of are going to be the four elements, which are earth, air, fire, and water. And it's time for another number. But this time I have no lovely assistant to give you the number. So I'll just have to tell you the next number is 8. The number 8. So mark that down. So substances, bigger substances are composed of smaller substances. And the elements themselves are substances that compose all these things. And I suppose the elements are the smallest substance. But in Aristotle's way of seeing things, he is not an atomist. Because the atomists, if you recall, believed that all the smallest substances were unique. And none was like each other, and they fit in. They connected with each other in unique ways, but it was like each atom is like a snowflake, and no two are alike. Whereas Aristotle ends up with a theory that's much more accurate to modern physics, which is that there are a limited number of elements, more than 4, but there are a limited number of elements, and that they combine in various ways, and they make up the larger things. So that's right, but the curious thing to Aristotle was that some of these larger things seem to have clearly a substance to themselves, a substantiality that was unique and distinct. So plants and their parts have they're discrete entities, unlike a pile of sand, right? A pile of sand seems to be a accumulation of individual things, but a tomato plant seems to be one thing that is has its own characteristic nature, which is embodied in its parts. So here we have an example. This is not a Platonic form. This is an actual tomato from our garden and back. So animals are another thing that seemed to Aristotle to clearly have their own distinctive nature, such that they were substances of themselves, substances in their own right. Human beings, obviously, and the parts of animals and human beings. So the arm, or the hand, right? The hand is, for Aristotle, a substance. That is probably related to his theories about teleology, right? So the hand has certain purposes, which we can see by reference to the purpose of the animal as a whole that has the hand. So the hand helps me to survive in various ways, and so we can imagine that the hand has a telos, just as I have a telos, whereas it might be different, and it might be stretching things to say that a grain of sand has a telos. Of course, that begs the question: what would the telos of the individual elements be? I have no idea what he would say about that. So now it's going to be time to talk about the unmoved mover. But it's time for me to take a break, and I will be right back almost instantaneously on your computer screen. Okay, we're back. A little bit of a costume change in between here. This is in celebration of this week's victory. I'm wearing this shirt right now. So the game is Saturday. Be sure to watch. So we're going to talk about the unmoved mover that Aristotle hypothesized that there must be. So Aristotle was one for asking small, little, insignificant questions, like why is anything at all moving, right? Very, very subtle question there. And his solution to the problem of why anything would be moving is the notion of a necessary being. This is a phenomenally important notion in the history of philosophy. But it's also a notion that is very controversial because it's hard to see what necessity has to do with things. So we can see, for example, necessary states of affairs. It's a necessary state of affairs that all red things are red. It's a necessary state of affairs that all bachelors are unmarried. It's a necessary state of affairs that, as I argued in class the other day, that all people are alive, right? There are no dead people. That was my argument. A necessary state of affairs is a set of conditions that could not be. That is, in all possible worlds, as it were, this state of affairs holds. So you might say that red is necessarily a color. You can't imagine red being what it is without being a color. The notion of a necessary being is the notion of a substance that could not be. Okay, that it's unimaginable and impossible for this substance not to exist. Why does this explain why anything is moving? Because, well, we can go on to the next slide to look at that. So movement is an actuality. So there's actualities and potentialities. Everything that is capable of moving, for example, our little clay here, or not clay, Play-Doh. Everything that is capable of moving has the potentiality of moving, even if it is not moving. And when something happens to it, when something actualizes it, it moves. The potentiality of this Play-Doh moving is actualized by another movement, an actual movement, which is the movement of my hand, or perhaps the movement of gravity. Hey, Joseph, come in here. So we're going to have another number coming up. Look out. Here he comes. Say 4. Get on the camera and say 4.
4.
Is that how old you are?
No.
Okay. Thank you. He's 5. But the number you need to remember is 4. So, when this hand gets moved from potentiality to actuality, which is caused by me, then it changes the Play-Doh from potentiality to actuality. Now, where do all these actualities come from? Because there must be something causing each set of the chain, an actuality causing each set of the chain to activate the potentialities. So if we take all the combination of all the things that are actualized, we need to realize that, so here's the argument, the things that possess both actualities and potentialities are all at some point not active. And if they weren't activated by some active agent, they would still be not active. So there must be some completely active agent with no mere potentialities. And to say that there must be that is to say that there is necessarily an active agent with no mere potentialities. And that active agent causes all the things that are potentially P to become actually P, or actually whatever they become. So this is sort of like the argument in the physics that there must be if there's movement, there must be a first mover, and that mover must be unmoved. And this is the same thing. This is the unmoved mover. But now we have it expressed in terms of actuality and activity. So that this is God, as it were, is completely active at all times and could not be. And we get that it could not be because things are moving. And they wouldn't be moving if there hadn't originally been something to set them in motion. Now, the interesting thing there is that it may not be the case, it may not be clear that things are necessarily moving. Things are actually moving, but they may not be necessarily moving. And so this argument might not work in its current form, because it would have to assume modally that things are necessarily moving, and we can't prove that. But this is a very influential argument, and it really sets the stage for the entire notion of the Judeo-Christian God as that vision of God was made Greek, as it were, or was influenced by Greek philosophy. So the notion is of a necessary being that had to exist and that accounts for the existence of everything else that exists. So there's the little theology lesson for the day, right? So now we're going to just trying to get some stuff done before we have class next week, Monday, because I want to move quickly through the end of Aristotle then. Now we're going to talk about, if I can get there, Aristotle's Politics. We're just going to start on this, just sort of whet your appetite for Aristotle's Politics. We need another number, though. Definitely need another number. Hey, Talitha! So we're waiting for another number to arrive. And then we'll talk about how the polis arrives. Hey, Talitha, come here. Can you tell everyone the number 3?
Yeah.
Say 3. Yeah, and can you hold up your fingers?
Yeah.
How many is 3?
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3?
Yeah.
Thank you. Give me a high five. Oh, yeah. Okay, go back to Mama. Thank you. So, the question for Aristotle in the Politics is what is the nature of the polis? So that's where we get the word politics from polis, which is the city-state, or you can think of it as the state. But generally, Greek states were not the types of things like America that would have 200 million people, 300 million people. Much smaller, much more manageable in terms of government. So how does the polis arise? The polis comes to be from the fundamental building block of basically a marriage, okay, of a family, but starts with pair bonding. And the polis is what happens. So you might imagine the sort of family unit as the seed from which it's kind of like an incomplete thing. It's not a finished product at all, but it's the seed from which the complete thing, which is the complete realization of human capacities, comes to be. So politics, for Aristotle, the political structure, was what made people who they could eventually be. And in fact, in the Nicomachean Ethics, which we're not reading, but in the Nicomachean Ethics, the human good, the human telos, which is happiness, is not achievable apart from community and apart from interaction with the others in the city. And so it is extraordinarily critical. Society is extraordinarily critical to the good of every human, and the marriage is like the seed, and society, the polis as a whole, is the mature version, the mature thing that grows out of that seed when it gets the right nutrients or whatever. According to Aristotle, human beings are political animals. It's a famous term. We're political animals. You might look at the way politicians treat each other and say, yeah, they're animals. But we're political animals capable of rational discourse about what's right or wrong. That's what it is to be the political type of animal as opposed to the other type of animal. So unlike other animals, according to Aristotle, we can talk about what's right or wrong. We can think about what's good or bad. The polis, once it is established, allows tons of new possibilities for the person. It comes to be out of this, similar to what Plato says, it comes to be out of this desire to provide for people's needs. So it comes to be for the sake of living, but it remains in being for the sake of living well. Okay? So it opens up the possibilities for living. But Aristotle's notion of what the city is going to look like is very different from Plato's notion. So if you remember from the Republic, we have a set of specialized roles that each member of the polis has. So you have the rulers, you have the soldiers, and you have the producers, and each is to keep to their own role. Aristotle says quite the opposite, and what Aristotle describes is very much like what Athenian culture was like in Aristotle's day, with some adjustments. But he says that ruling should not be a specialized thing for some small portion of the population, but in fact that everyone should take a turn on being in a ruling position. And that was the custom in Athens, was that you would be appointed by lot to a position. If you were a citizen, you would be appointed by lot to a position of authority. So can you imagine us picking the President of the United States out of every citizen of the United States? We just have a lottery, and the person who wins becomes president, right? This is a little bit what like Athens was. But Athens was also democratic, so that the person who was in charge was more of an administrator rather than a legislator. We in America like to think that we're democratic, but we're nowhere near as democratic as Athens was, where they would literally take votes on the laws. But the governmental structure that Aristotle recommended was much more like Athens than Plato's perfect city, Callipolis, that means the beautiful city. The property structure, so in Callipolis, at least the guardians, the elites, the ruling class and the soldier class, they possessed no private property. They owned nothing to themselves. Everything belonged to the city. Aristotle says that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. People like having stuff. Why should we keep them from having stuff? He says it's unbelievably more pleasant to regard something as one's own than it to be sort of collectively held in common. And so he thought that even though the goal was for people to share their possessions and to allow other people to have use of their possessions, it would be much more satisfactory for each person if they actually had those possessions, as opposed to them being possessed in common. And Aristotle's notion of family structure was very different from Plato's. So Plato's notion was that children would be denied the ability to find out who their parents were, and they would call every adult in the city either father or mother. And there would be, so the family would be this massive social entity. And the notion is that we could take the richness and the goodness of a small family and extend it out to the entire society, so that you treat everyone like their family. But Aristotle gave a very good criticism of this, which is that it's well expressed by the quotation by Dash in the movie The Incredibles, which is his mother says, "Everybody's special, Dash." And he says in response, well, that's just another way of saying nobody is. Right? If we say that everyone is your father, well, that's no help. Because no one will take that special role. In Plato's envisionment of the city. So you tell everyone to treat every person like their son and or daughter, and that's not going to provide for what the individual people need in terms of family structure. And Aristotle recognized that. And so he had a number of correctives that make his notion of politics much more similar to Athenian culture as it was than to Plato's notion of politics. So I'm going to give you another number. I'm not going to bring any little people in to give you another number. The number, again, will be 3. Here's another 3. So now you should have 6 numbers listed so far. 6 numbers on your sheet. Okay. Now we can talk about the metaphysics of the city. So the city is not a simple. It is a composite, similar to the way that a table is a composite or a human being is a composite. We're made up of smaller things. And the thing that the polis is composed of is the citizenry, each of the citizens. Interestingly, Aristotle does not say that it's composed of each of the people inside the city. So there are a lot of people. There were foreigners. There were medics, which is a type of official foreigner, a sort of a resident alien. There were slaves. There were women and children. None of those are citizens in Athenian culture, and none of those are citizens according to what Aristotle says. Aristotle says that the distinctive mark of a citizen is that this is a person who shares in judging and ruling. And he says that doesn't have to be that they're a judge or that they are a ruler or a legislator, right? It just means that they have to have some role. So, for example, being on a jury would be a case in which you would be sharing in judging and ruling. So the citizens have various talents, but the function or the work of the citizens is to secure the safety of the community. So each citizen has a different type of skill set, but when they work as citizens in the community, each of those skill sets are going to secure the safety and prosperity of the city as a whole. And this is typical of Aristotle. He thinks that we get that a complex organism, as it were, accomplishes what it does through a lot of different types of activities. So that the one person is constructing a house, the other person is selling things at a market, the other person is studying philosophy, and all of these people with their various talents and the various things that they do, they all of the things that they do sort of coalesce into the good of the community. And in the performing of their function, we get to their telos, and the telos is the safety and the prosperity of the community. So, I mean, Aristotle really thinks of a city, a polis, in just the same way that he might think of a house, and in just the same way that he might think of an animal, of any composite, anything made up of other things that nevertheless has a nature, has an essence, and has a purpose. And the purpose of the city is the good of the citizens in terms of the safety and prosperity of the community. the good citizen does not simply have the ability to rule, though the good citizen must also know how to be ruled, because otherwise you would have anarchy. So we cycle through who's in charge, but everyone who's in charge needs to know how to be obedient and how to be ruled. We're going to cover one more thing before we're done. Here's your next number. This is the 7th number on the list. The 7th number on the list is the number 1. 1. Okay, and then one more thing that we're going to cover is the notion of natural slaves. This is, ancient philosophers are often rightly criticized for the way that they handle discussions of women and the worth and the value and the intelligence of women, and often how they handle slaves. Aristotle comes in for particular condemnation for his notion that not only does he think slavery is morally permissible, but he thinks that some people are naturally inclined to be slaves. Not inclined like they want to be slaves, but that what is best for them is to be slaves. And that is just how they were born, how nature made them. Obviously a very controversial and very disturbing view of human nature. I'm going to try and explain how he might have thought this. But first of all, his notion of this was very much the notion that a natural slave was someone for whom the best good that they could achieve in life was by being a slave, that they would be benefited by it. And they would be benefited by it because of this interesting coincidence that the interest of the master and the interest of the slave coincide. So that the master, simply by doing what the master wants to benefit his own interest, will do what makes the slave happy and fulfilled. That is a very hopeful view, I suppose. It's really the only type of view that I can imagine on which someone could possibly justify slavery. Slavery, if it could possibly be justified, which I don't think it can, but if it could possibly be justified, it would have to be justified not only on the basis of the good for the master, but on the basis of the good for the slave. If the best lot for a person was to be a slave, if that's the best sort of life that they could possibly have, given their natural characteristics, then it wouldn't be cruel to make them slaves. It would rather be kind to make them slaves. But that's a very questionable thesis, that the best lot of someone could be to be a slave. And moreover, the idea that no one would ever have to look after you and what would be good for you, because doing what was good for them would be good for you, right? That's a little bit disturbing. No one has to be kind to a slave. They just have to be selfish. And then it'll be good for the natural slave, because these things coincide. These things run parallel, as it were. Now, Aristotle did not think that we should enslave people who are not natural slaves, maybe to short-term versions of slavery, maybe to indentured servitude, but not to permanent slavery. Because for them, the interest of the master and the slave do not coincide. So you have to be in this narrow set of people who are naturally slaves in order for it to be good for you to be enslaved. Now, is there any defense for Aristotle on this? I think there's probably not much of a defense. The only thing that could be said is that there are categories of people in society who have such cognitive difficulties, they have such difficulty functioning in any way, that they, I would say, shouldn't always be allowed to make their own decisions. Or rather, you have to very carefully try and evaluate what it is that they really want, because by too quickly allowing them to do what they think they want in a certain scenario. My father experienced a head injury, and there was a period of time where this happened with him, where if we let him do whatever he wanted, that would be very bad for him. So there may be this sort of category of person that simply following what they want to do in a given scenario is not good for them, and so they should be restrained from doing so. But I think that we have to be very careful in that, and that the goal should not be simply to use them, right? To say, here's what I want, and I'm going to tell you to do what I want, and it will just coincide with what's good for you. That doesn't sound realistic at all. Rather, if someone's in that sort of category, this category where they have mental difficulties pursuing what's good for them, I think that you should try and give as best of an approximation as you can of what is good for them, to evaluate that for yourself and to talk to people. And then, insofar as you intervene in their life, intervene for their good, right? Not intervene for your own good. So I would just come down completely against Aristotle on this point. And now you can go eat some turkey or do whatever you do over Thanksgiving weekend. But first I need to give you your final number. The final number, and this is the 8th number that you should have listed. The final number is 7. 7. Okay. See you Monday. How do I get this to stop recording?